Well, welcome. I'm going to be talking about refrigeration before refrigerators. And most everybody is familiar with refrigerators, but at Ruthmere, we talk about the ice room in the kitchen and the ice box that used to be there. And the tours always include a stop at the rear of the house to point out the ice delivery door, where ice was delivered. Visitors often remark that the door is so high, and you'll soon see a reason for that. It's also difficult for children to comprehend someone delivering ice to your house. I've had some ask, why would somebody deliver ice cubes to the house? And I often tell visitors that I've heard stories about harvesting ice from Simonton Lake north of Elkhart. Unfortunately, I was unsuccessful finding any photos or literature to support my claims, and my go-to source for information is no longer around. I'm referring, of course, to the late Paul Thomas. Still, I'll try and convey what I mean when I say harvesting ice and give you a glimpse of the process of harvesting and distributing ice before the era of modern refrigerators. And this first view, you may have guessed, is not from Elkhart. Most of the photos will be from states and climates from the northern U.S. But we'll start with a few factoids. The ice industry itself got its start in New England around the early 1800s. Of course, people had been cutting ice out of rivers and lakes for centuries to keep their food and items cold. But in 1805, the son of a wealthy Boston businessman by the name of Frederick Tudor shipped ice around the world as far away as Bombay, India, and became known as the Ice King. He borrowed money to purchase a ship and started shipping these blocks of ice to places first in the southern states and as far as Florida, and later his business grew. But in the late 1800s, the growing population around Boston caused the waters to be more polluted. Rivers and ponds in Maine were the perfect water source for the ice business. And by the 1890s, Maine was producing 1.5 million tons of ice, and more than 25,000 men worked in the ice fields along the Kennebec River. In this next slide from the state of Maine, and as you'll see, harvesting was a labor-intensive business, not to mention a cold process. These next two photos will give you an idea of what it might have been like out on the lake harvesting ice. Anybody getting cold? Well, by the late 1880s, ice was the second largest export in the United States behind cotton. And in 1886 alone, 25 million tons were cut and stored or shipped in the United States. Here you see some men cutting ice on a lake. And in 1886, just to add perspective to this, Elkhart had only been a city for 11 years. A.R. and Elizabeth were still living on High Street in Elkhart. Their child Ruth had died 6 years earlier, and Dr. Miles hadn't yet formed his partnership with A.R. Beardsley and Dr. Compton. This just shows some common tools used in the harvesting process, and you can get an idea of the size of the saws by the man standing there holding them. And some more examples of the different methods used to cut ice and different sizes and shapes that they would come in. Some are thin sheets, some are the larger, thicker blocks. And this shows that the harvest was done in January and would last for several weeks. Harvesting ice was very hard and a very cold job, as I mentioned. Employees included part-timers such as farmers and carpenters, anyone who didn't have a full-time winter work. And the harvest usually ran 24 hours a day. Imagine working the night shift on a cold winter night with only the moonlight and kerosene lanterns for illumination, all the while being near open water where ice had been cut. When I mentioned labor-intensive, that hardly tells the whole story. It could also be quite dangerous. But what do you do with the ice after it's cut? You had to store it somewhere, much like any other crop. The harvest season was short. Here's a view of a ice barn or ice storage facility. Had to get the ice inside and maneuver it around. This shows a couple of men shifting ice inside the barn once it's there. If you notice, it's obviously hard work, and as cold as it would have been, these men were probably sweating because they appear to have removed their coats. Another example of an ice house. They came in all shapes and sizes. And then, what's it used for? Well, we always tell visitors about the ice storage room, point out where the ice box was. This just shows an example of a typical residential ice box in that era, early era. Another picture shows a commercial size or possibly a large residence like an estate. Unfortunately, there are no pictures of the ice box at Ruthmere. And also a little more modern ice box photo from the 1920s shows how large blocks of ice were used to keep food cold in the ice boxes. This lasted into the 1930s when we had the mechanical or electric refrigerators in homes. This shows an electric refrigerator from the 1930s, similar to the one we see at Ruthmere. Home refrigeration became even more widespread in the 1930s following the introduction of Freon, a safer alternative to toxic gases previously used in the vapor compression method. This General Electric monitor top refrigerator was from the 1930s. The name comes from its resemblance to the 1860s warship, the USS Monitor. People saw that similarity with the turret on top. And of course, there had to be a way to get the ice to the customers. You see a couple of pictures of the ice delivery wagons, one obviously from Wisconsin. Now it's easy to see why the access door would be so high. The bed of the wagon would be at floor level for some houses. The wagon bed would also be the level of the platform, making it easier for loading the wagons. And the ice delivery men, of course, they had to deliver the ice. Sorry ladies, these guys aren't from Elkhart. And there's one man that's not wearing gloves either. I even have trouble lifting a bag of ice. And more ice delivery women. Yep, during the war, women were called to do a lot of the work that the men would have been doing. The ice tongs are ones from the Havilah Beardsley house. There's no ice room documented at Havilah Beardsley house, but they would have had access to the river and may have needed to move ice from there with something like this. And here we have a couple examples of signs that people would use for the iceman to deliver. He'd make daily rounds delivering ice. Customers would leave a card like this one in their window to tell the iceman what size block they wanted that day. It would depend on what figure showed at the top, 25, 50, or 75 or 100 pounds. The iceman would cut the block to size and deliver it to the kitchen. Yeah, but what about Elkhart? Well, I have a couple of different ice companies that I found record of. The St. Joe Ice Company. Here's a picture of the wagon with the proprietors. And these photos come from the Elkhart County Historical Society. These guys aren't quite as handsome as the other guys you saw. And another one was the Crystal Ice Company. Here's a couple of their wagons and their ice house. And I have some pictures from the Historical Society taken on about the St. Joe River. These men are not harvesting the ice in the photograph, but in the winter of 1913, the inscription shows that this is looking west from the Elkhart and Western Railroad Bridge. This one shows the looking east towards the dam and the power plant. And this photo is kind of obvious. It's just a big ice jam in the river. The snow cover probably wouldn't have been ideal for cutting ice, but it would have been important to break up the ice jam. And I couldn't resist including this photo from 1932. It's a photograph of the Winchester mansion, and you'll see that the street is flooded and a lot of snow and ice around the house. We don't see many winters like this anymore. I think that's a good thing. And someone pointed out that this would have been before the underpass was built, so there would have been not much place for the water to go to. And this next set of photos clearly illustrates the sequence of the ice harvest. Scooping the snow off the ice, scoring the ice, sawing blocks, feeding them into the ice house, and then loading blocks into a boxcar. You didn't think you'd hear one of my talks without hearing about trains, did you? Found a lot of interesting information about Sandusky, Ohio. It's popular for more than just the amusement rides there. Some of the more unusual freight hauled by the railroad was natural ice, freshwater fish, wine and beer. And peak production roughly spanned the years between 1875 and 1890, but continued into the 1920s. In good years, up to 400,000 tons were extracted from the bay and either stored in one of the 50 ice houses or loaded directly into freight cars for shipment. During the peak harvest system, as many as 500 boxcars of ice would leave Sandusky each day. And locally, it was used for shipment of fish, produce, and production of beer for the local breweries. Here are examples of icing refrigerator cars, or reefers as they're called. You'll see how that's done. But the two largest users of ice outside of Sandusky were the slaughterhouses of Cincinnati and Chicago, and the breweries of St. Louis. And locally, it was used for shipment of fish and produce, and again, the production of beer in the local breweries. By the 1800s, mid-1800s, Sandusky was one of the largest producers of freshwater fish in the country. That was an interesting trivia fact, I thought, that in addition to being the largest fishery, Sandusky was the center of the American caviar trade. Bulk caviar was packed in barrels and shipped to Germany, repackaged in glass jars with German labels, and re-exported to the U.S. to be sold at a hefty premium. I would have never thought of Sandusky as being the center of the caviar trade. But here, another view of wine being brought across the Sandusky Bay, and large casks and the horses pulling the casks. The shallow nature of Sandusky Bay was ideal for the ice to form. And it just gives you an idea of how much ice could form in a day. But ice harvesting didn't last forever. The decline of ice harvesting in 1914, the U.S. was using 24 million tons of manufactured ice and 26 million tons of natural ice. In 1932, there were 30 million family households in America, and still 1/3 of the population had no refrigerator or icebox. But in the late 1930s, President Roosevelt signed an executive order to create the Rural Electrification Administration. So by 1950, 90% of the American households had mechanical refrigerators, and 80% of the rural households were equipped that way. So ice demand declined during World War II years, and by the mid-50s, the ice business was almost gone. But a couple interesting things again. public opinion helped extend the demand for natural ice. Even into the 50s, resorts and luxury hotels still wanted natural ice. The ice made from mechanically refrigerated ice was often cloudy, and natural ice had better clarity. And some customers even perceived that it had an unpleasant taste. And ice harvesting business hasn't fared well in the era of changes in climate either. And a side note, I was contacted through Ruthmere by a woman who grew up in Elkhart, and her grandfather was a vice president at Railway's Ice and Service Company, began in Kansas City, and he eventually went to Chicago. And she had visited Ruthmere a couple of years ago and watched a YouTube video. She sent me this information, the photograph of the spotlight, and in it was an article about her grandfather. And in there they point out that present annual sales exceeds 350,000 tons. This is in January and February of 1955. Average of 280,000 cars are iced every year. And in recent years, electronically controlled car icing has displaced hand icing of the plants. And another article that just talks about Frank King shows that he was visiting his son in Atlanta, and just has a quote quote from him that he sees no threat to transport icing. He's confident that in-transit car icing and truck icing will continue to hold current volumes. I think he was a little bit wrong, because it didn't take long before that even was out of date. And today, there's not much evidence at all of any hand icing or natural icing of cars. But there are still some places that consider a recreational or educational form of harvesting ice, just to keep the history alive. Well, that pretty well concludes it. And the last page just shows some of the references that I used for this information, and a few additional sources. I do want to thank Joy Olson for allowing me to see some of her ice delivery cards that she had, and I want to thank everybody for coming.